The Seamstress of Thornfield Park, a story of hidden identity, class injustice, and quiet reckoning. Yorkshire, England, November 1868. She had owned that house for 2 years and 11 months without anyone at the dining table knowing it. The brooch in Mrs. Euphemia Sloane's raised fist, the one she was presenting to 14 dinner guests as evidence of theft, had been given to the rightful mistress of Thornfield Park's mother by the dying Baron Wyndham himself, 15 minutes before the marriage register was signed, 3 hours before he stopped breathing. It had passed from a dead woman's throat to her daughter's hands on the day she died, been carried against that daughter's skin every day since on a short gold chain beneath a grey wool blouse, and was now being held aloft by a woman in a silk Worth gown, while she called the woman it belonged to a common, ungrateful thief. In the dining hall that was hers, on the cold marble floor that was hers, before 14 people who had come to eat at a table that was hers and had absolutely no idea. 30 pairs of eyes watched the woman in the seamstress's apron. Not one voice said anything. Not one gloved hand moved. They did not know, not yet, that the carriage from London was already turning through the gates. If you believe that a person's worth is not measured by the cloth of her apron or the title before her name, please take a quick moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment letting us know which city or country you are watching this story from. Your presence here helps keep these quiet voices of justice alive. Now, let us begin. Thornfield Park had stood on the eastern edge of the North Yorkshire moors for 214 years, quarried from the same grey limestone hillside it overlooked. Its long south-facing facade, running 130 feet across a terrace of dressed stone above 300 acres of managed woodland, sheep-grazed upland, and tenant farmland that descended in gentle, irregular folds toward the market town of Harrogate, 4 miles to the southwest. The house was neither grand nor modest by Yorkshire standards. It was simply old in the way that very few houses in England manage to be old, which is to say continuously occupied by the same family through 8 monarchs and 11 generations, until the occupation has accumulated in the stones and the floorboards and the walls a quality of presence that cannot be imported or manufactured or convincingly performed. The Turkey carpet in the principal corridor was worn precisely along the path that generations of Wyndham footsteps had traced between the study and the library, not worn thin, because it had been replaced twice in 2 centuries, but worn always in the same place, the same narrow track of intention, the same route taken by the same family's feet for the same reasons. The oil portraits in their gilt frames looked out at the corridor with the settled authority of people who have long since ceased needing to prove they belong there. The library ran to 4,320 volumes, catalogued in a leather-bound ledger whose handwriting had changed 3 times as the task passed from one steward to the next, each new hand absorbing the organization imposed by the previous one, layer upon layer, the way the house itself absorbed its own history. The rooms smelled of beeswax polish, wood smoke, the particular old paper smell of books that have been read by the same family for 100 years, and beneath all of this the specific quality of damp stone and honest occupation that has no name in any language but is instantly identifiable to anyone who has ever been inside such a house as the smell of a place that has been genuinely lived in. The late Bertram Charles Wyndham, 4th Baron Wyndham, had been the last person to move through those corridors with the ease of a man who has never once needed to consider whether he belongs there. He had died on the 31st of October, 1866, at 61 years of age, the greater portion of his final 12 months spent in the east wing of the house under the care of a Harrogate physician whose Tuesday and Thursday visits had grown, over the course of the year, shorter in duration and quieter in tone. The Baron had been, by all surviving accounts, a man of orderly habits, precise loyalties, and the kind of long silences that indicate not absence of thought, but rather its excess. A man who had managed Thornfield Park for 31 years, without significant debt or scandal, who had treated his tenants with a fairness that was not fashionable in the 1860s, and his servants, with a consideration that was not common in any decade, and who had carried, into the final year of his life, one significant piece of unfinished business that he had deferred for 22 years and was now determined to complete before he no longer had the strength. He had completed it, barely. On the morning after the Baron's death, a carriage was sent from Thornfield Park to collect Mr. Gerald Sloane and his wife Euphemia from their house in Harrogate. Gerald Sloane was the nearest male relation with any claim on the estate, a connection so theoretical and so remote that it existed primarily in the documents of an entail made 40 years earlier, when the Baron was a young man, and such provisions were standard legal caution against the hypothetical of dying without a direct heir. Gerald was the son of the Baron's mother's half-cousin's son, which meant that the relationship between the two men was largely a matter of solicitors rather than blood or affection. They had met 4 times in their respective lives, none of those meetings memorable to either party. He had managed, for the preceding decade, the Sheffield division of a manufacturing concern dealing in rolled iron components, and had done so with moderate competence and no distinction whatsoever. His wife Euphemia had grown up above the forge in the figurative, if not quite the literal sense. Her father had been a steelwork supervisor. Her grandfather had made the original Sloane money in the black country furnaces in the early years of the century. She had received a good education, a careful upbringing, and the specific anxiety that is produced in a person who has been told all her life that she is entitled to something better without being given the instinctive ease that would allow her to inhabit that something better once it arrived. She had married Gerald Sloane at 23, with very clear ideas about where they were going to arrive, and she had been working toward that arrival with the deliberate, effortful concentration of a woman who cannot afford to stop every day since. She stepped out of the hired carriage at the front steps of Thornfield Park on the morning after the Baron's death, in a black morning gown, made to measure in 38 hours by a Harrogate dressmaker who had stayed up through the night to finish it. She looked up at the grey limestone facade in the flat November light, at the long south-facing windows and the dressed stone terrace and the elm trees along the outer drive, and she smiled. It was a small smile, tightly controlled, proprietary, in a way that has nothing to do with any legitimate property right, and it was observed by the butler, Mr. Ford, who was standing at the top of the steps to receive her, and who had served 3 generations of Wyndhams in this house, and who did not forget what he saw. Within 4 weeks of the Sloanes' arrival, 14 of the household's 22 servants had been dismissed. Mr. Ford was among them. He received 1 month's notice, a character reference written in terms that were technically accurate and practically useless, and £5. He was 61 years old and had been the butler of Thornfield Park for 19 years. The housekeeper, Mrs. Cooper, who could have told the incoming household the price of every piece of silver in the house, the name of every tradesman who supplied the estate, the preferences of every person who had ever sat at the dining table, and the full history and current condition of everything from the roof to the wine cellar, she received 1 week's notice and £3. The head gardener who had laid out the kitchen garden in its current form was dismissed the same day. The stable lads, the under-footmen, the laundry maids, the kitchen girls who had grown up in the house, and who knew it in the way that only people who have worked in a place for years can know it, in their hands and their routines, and their instinctive sense of how the rooms connect, gone, all of them, within the first month. In their place came a new household, assembled by Euphemia with the urgent efficiency of a woman who understands that her performance depends absolutely on her supporting cast. A butler imported from a Manchester commercial hotel, who had no memory of the Wyndham family and no basis for comparison, and who had been chosen specifically because he did not ask questions that were not his business. A cook from a Sheffield house, where Euphemia's family had connections, who prepared the food of Euphemia's childhood in the dishes of her ambition. A lady's maid from London named Price. New footmen who did not know which chairs were preferred, or which topics were never raised at table. Young women for the kitchen who had nothing to compare with anything, and therefore found nothing wanting. They would not remember. They would not notice what was absent. They would not see any difference between what Thornfield Park was and what it was now pretending to be, because they had never seen the original. One person had not been dismissed. Beatrice Fenn, the name she had given when she presented herself for work, Fenn being her mother's maiden name, adopted for reasons she did not explain to anyone, was listed in the household employment ledger as a seamstress and embroiderer, engaged at 12 shillings per week, with room and board. She had been present in the house when the Sloanes arrived and had remained present through every dismissal and every rearrangement, quietly useful enough to retain and sufficiently unremarkable in her plain grey wool dress, plain linen cap, and mended kid gloves to avoid attracting particular attention. She occupied the smallest room in the east wing, the one at the end of the north corridor, with the window that gave onto the kitchen garden and admitted very little light in the afternoons. And she said nothing about the cold in winter, or the thinness of the meals sent up from the kitchen, or the coal allowance that was measurably inadequate for a pride room of that size and that exposure. She was 24 years old, with dark eyes and the kind of composed bearing that resolved, depending on where you positioned yourself to look at it, into two very different things. From where Euphemia stood, which was the position she occupied whenever she happened to notice the seamstress at all, it looked like the composure of a woman who cannot afford to protest. From a better angle, which no one in the new household had thought to find, it looked like the composure of a woman who has made a decision and finds no difficulty in waiting for it to mature. She had been waiting for 2 years, 11 months, and 6 days. During this time she had done her work correctly, consistently, and without requiring praise for it. She had embroidered 12 cushion covers, repaired 43 pairs of gloves, relined 4 evening capes, altered 11 gowns for the changes of a woman's figure and fashion across 2 years, and produced, on request, a set of initialed handkerchiefs in satin stitch that the cook said were the finest she had seen in 40 years of service in good houses. She had been asked, on 2 occasions, to assist Price in the principal bedroom, and had done so without requiring instruction. She had spoken civilly to every new servant who arrived, because none of them had chosen the situation they were in, and most of them were young, and some of them were far from home. She had said nothing to any of them about what she knew, not because she did not trust them, but because it was not their knowledge to carry. She had not always been Beatrice Fenn. She had been born Beatrice Constance Wyndham on the 8th of April, 1844, in a house in Harrogate, to a woman named Catherine Fenn, who had been, for 7 years at that point, the private companion, and in all the ways that genuinely mattered, the companion in the fullest and most honest sense of an unmarried man who had found himself, at 40, more attached to her than he had anticipated and less capable of doing anything formally about it than either of them would have wished. Bertram Wyndham was a baron with the social expectations of his rank. Catherine was the daughter of a Harrogate solicitor, respectable, untitled, entirely without the necessary connections. In the 1840s, in Yorkshire, the distance between those two positions was not one that reduced itself easily to a question of personal feeling. He had provided for Catherine, and for Beatrice, privately for 22 years, visited the Harrogate house with the regularity of a man who has found it impossible to stay away, educated his daughter at his own expense in the full curriculum expected of a young woman of her actual rank, treated both of them with the steady loyalty of a man who knows the private accounts of his own conduct and has been measuring them against a standard he has not yet met. Catherine had aged into a woman of deep patience and a clear-eyed affection that had long since passed through the stage of expectation into something more durable. She had not asked, in 22 years, for anything he had not freely given. When her consumption became apparent in the spring of 1866, and her physician made the forecast that Bertram's physician was simultaneously making on his own behalf, the two of them had sat together in the Harrogate garden on an evening in June and arrived, without drama or sentiment, at the understanding that he was going to do what he should have done 22 years ago. He would marry her. He would revise his will. He would establish Beatrice as his legitimate heir. It was late. It was inadequate. It was, nonetheless, what he intended to do. And he intended to do it correctly. He had done it. The will was prepared by Mr. Jonas Whitfield of Whitfield and Sons, Lincoln's Inn, the Wyndham family's London solicitor for 30 years, trusted with the kind of matter that requires absolute discretion, executed on the 7th of October, 1866, in the presence of 2 witnesses whose attestations were properly recorded. The marriage was solemnized at St. Anne's Church, Harrogate, on the 14th of October, in the presence of the Reverend Edmund Calder and 2 attending witnesses, recorded in the parish register on the same date. Catherine died on the 22nd of October, 8 days after the wedding. She died with the brooch at her throat, in the room above the Harrogate house where she had lived for 22 years, and Beatrice had taken the brooch from her mother's throat afterward and put it on the chain she had worn it on every day since. Bertram died on the 31st of October, 9 days later, without having made the presentation he had intended. Gerald Sloane's solicitor, a man named Cresswell, whose Sheffield firm had managed Sloane family accounts for a generation, arrived at Thornfield Park 2 days after the Baron's death and moved through the probate process with a speed that the Leeds court found entirely unremarkable and that, in retrospect, would come to appear considerably more deliberate than expedient. He produced the existing will, the one made 12 years earlier, which named Gerald Sloane as heir of last resort in the standard way, and did not mention the newer will, or the marriage, or the woman working in the East Wing at 12 shillings per week. He had been paid £312 in 3 separate installments for this management of affairs. Beatrice had known, within a week of the Sloanes' arrival, that the true will existed. Her father had told her, on the last afternoon she had sat beside his bed, the name of the solicitor and the address of the firm. She had written to Mr. Whitfield in January of 1867, a careful letter. He had replied in equally careful language. He held the documents. He was prepared to act when circumstances permitted. He required time and instruction and, above all, the evidence sufficient to support a legal challenge that would withstand Cresswell's inevitable counter-arguments. She had given him 2 years of accumulated evidence. During those 2 years, she had maintained correspondence through the Harrogate post office with former members of the household who had been dismissed and who had, some of them, things to say. She had identified and located the 2 witnesses to her parents' marriage. She had traced, through patient inquiry and the social invisibility of a plain woman occupying herself with needlework in a public tear-room while listening to 2 men discussing accounts at the next table, the financial connection between Cresswell's firm and the Sloane family's Sheffield business. All of this had been communicated to Whitfield over time, in letters that said very little unless you knew how to read them. The hearing in Leeds had concluded in October. The documentation from the Lord Lyon, King of Arms, had arrived at Whitfield and Sons on the 2nd of November. The brougham had been booked for the 14th, the 2nd anniversary of her parents' marriage. Not for sentiment, for precision, Mrs. Euphemia Sloane had, in 2 years at Thornfield Park, succeeded in building something that resembled a social position if you did not examine it from certain angles. The county families of North Yorkshire are not cruel people. They have long memories and a particular quality of polite distance they extend to those who have not yet been in a place long enough to be there. A distance not of contempt, but of suspended assessment, maintained with perfect courtesy until the assessment concludes. Euphemia had entertained and been entertained, had given dinner parties and received morning calls, had attended the appropriate churches and contributed to the appropriate charities, and had acquired, over time, something that resembled a tentative place in the county's social geography, but the angles at which it remained most precarious were the angles at which Gerald Sloane was most conspicuous in the way he held his wineglass, in the Sheffield names that slipped occasionally into his conversation, in the way the Thornfield Park library had been rearranged by someone who had not read the books, in the quality of the silver, which did not quite match and had not been in the family long enough to have been in the family. Euphemia's cruelty had a specific and locatable source. It was fear. She was afraid every single day that someone in the house or the county would see through her performance. And because she could not admit this fear to herself, because admission would have required a degree of self-knowledge that her entire social project depended upon preventing, she converted it into the thing that felt more manageable, which was contempt. Contempt for servants who moved too slowly, for tradesmen who came to the front entrance rather than the back, for clergymen who were not quite the correct kind, for anyone in the house who reminded her, by existing in a certain way, that there are qualities that cannot be purchased after the event. Beatrice reminded her of this every day without intending to or being aware of it. There was something in the seamstress's manner in the way she moved through the house without deference or apology, in the quiet with which she received instructions and completed them, in the settled air of a person who has never needed to prove anything to anyone, because proof is not something she has ever been required to offer, that put a specific, unnamed irritation under Euphemia's skin that she could not locate and therefore could not remove. The small cruelties had begun within the first month and had not interrupted themselves since. They were not the dramatic cruelties of a woman who enjoys spectacle. There was no single dramatic scene, no memorable confrontation that a person could point to afterward and say, that was the moment. They were the sustained, daily, accumulating cruelties of a woman who needs, through repeated small demonstrations, to establish the order she requires. The thinner meals sent to the East Wing, the coal allowance maintained at an inadequate level through 2 winters, the errands assigned at the end of the afternoon too late to complete before dark. The comment delivered in passing in the principal corridor, I suppose the sewing is adequate for a woman of your background, which I imagine was not extensive, without stopping or making eye contact. The morning Euphemia entered the East Wing room without knocking, stood looking slowly around it for nearly a minute, and then departed without explanation or apparent purpose beyond the act of entry itself. There was the occasion, in the autumn of 1867, when a set of curtain rings was found broken in the drawing-room, and Euphemia called Beatrice, before 2 other servants, to account for them speaking for 3 minutes about the value of what had been entrusted to the household's keeping and the responsibility of those who worked among good things to treat them with corresponding care. The curtain rings had been broken by one of the new footmen, a fact both Euphemia and the other servants present knew with certainty, and which Beatrice also knew, and which none of them said. There was the following January, when Beatrice came to collect the embroidery frame she had left in the morning room, and found that it had been moved to the servants' corridor, with a note in Euphemia's hand, stating that needlework materials were not to be left in the principal rooms. The principal room had been empty when she had left it there. It had been empty every morning that week. There was the October of '67, when a tradesman arrived at the front entrance with a consignment of linen thread ordered for the embroidery work. Beatrice was called to the drawing-room to account for having given the tradesman the front entrance address, rather than directing him to the tradesman's door at the rear of the house. She had, in fact, given him no address of any kind. He had come to the front entrance because that was the address on his order book from a delivery made under the previous household, 3 years before her arrival, but she said none of this. She stood in the drawing-room and said, "Yes, ma'am, and I understand," ma'am in the appropriate places, while Euphemia explained, at length, that the standards maintained in a house of consequence extended to the management of tradesmen and the preservation of the appropriate entrance for the appropriate visitor, and that a woman in Beatrice's position, who could not grasp this distinction, was a woman whose usefulness to the household was a matter that might require reconsideration. The tradesman was still waiting at the back entrance when Beatrice went to receive the thread. She thanked him for his patience, and he said there was no need, and then she carried the thread upstairs to the East Wing room and sat down at the window, and did nothing for 7 minutes, which was, in 2 years and 11 months at Thornfield Park, the longest she allowed herself. And there was the afternoon in the long gallery, March of 1868, 8 months before the dinner party, when Beatrice paused for a moment beside the portrait of the 3rd Baron Wyndham, her grandfather, which Euphemia had not removed because she had not recognized it and therefore not understood it to be significant. Beatrice stood looking at the portrait with the particular attention of a person looking at a face they know, and Euphemia, passing along the corridor, observed her. "A seamstress," said Euphemia, in the controlled, pleasant voice she used when she wanted to say something unpleasant correctly, "ought to be about her work, rather than occupying spaces where she serves no useful function." Beatrice looked at her with those steady dark eyes. She said nothing. She moved on. This was the thing that Euphemia found most intolerable about the seamstress, and had found most intolerable for 2 years. The seamstress never flinched. People in her position were supposed to flinch. The dinner party of the 14th of November had been in preparation for 3 weeks. 14 guests from families of consequence in the North Riding Lord and Lady Alderton of Alderton Hall. Sir Robert Fairmont and his wife from the Fairmont estate across the valley. Captain Harcourt, recently returned from India with a captaincy and a young wife named Eleanor. The Reverend Peel and Mrs. Peel from Harrogate. Mr. James Elliston, a justice of the peace, and his wife. 6 further members of the county's respectable gentry, whose names appeared regularly in the Yorkshire Gazette and whose presence at Thornfield Park represented, for Euphemia, something she had been working toward with the focused intensity that characterized all her most important projects. She had engaged the cook with 5-course menus and supplemented the kitchen staff with a woman brought up from Harrogate specifically for the pastry work. She had ordered new napery from a Leeds linen merchant. She had rearranged the table seating 3 times, making and remaking the careful calculations of proximity and precedence that govern the management of 14 consequential people at a formal dinner. She had sent to a Harrogate wine merchant for additional claret, and had, on discovering a shortfall of 2 bottles in the delivery, written the merchant a letter of such controlled displeasure that the merchant responded within the day with the missing bottles and a hand-delivered apology. She had, in the fortnight preceding the dinner, spent 2 mornings walking the principal rooms to assess them with the eye of a woman who is trying to see her house as it will be seen by people who are looking at it for the first time and will be comparing it against houses they have known for 100 years. She was not entirely satisfied. The dining room was correct, the table set, the silver placed, the portraits in their positions, the fire laid and dressed. The drawing room was acceptable, though she found herself troubled by something in the arrangement of the smaller pieces on the mantelpiece that she could not quite diagnose. She moved them slightly, which helped, and then moved them back, which was the same. She called Price in to look at the mantelpiece, and Price said it looked very well, and Euphemia dismissed her and stood alone in the drawing room, looking at the arrangement of objects on the shelf and understanding, without the vocabulary to say so, that the difficulty was not the arrangement. It was the knowledge, which she spent a considerable amount of her energy not knowing, that there is a quality of ease that cannot be arranged into a room, that it either accumulates over generations, or it is absent, and that its absence is perceptible to anyone who has grown up around it, in a way that no number of correct arrangements and no combination of the right silver and the right portraits and the right guests can conceal. On the morning of the 14th of November, Price developed a fever and was unable to leave her room. Euphemia appeared in the east wing doorway at 4:20 without knocking. "You," she said, finding Beatrice at the north-facing window with her embroidery in the failing afternoon light. "You will attend me this evening. Price is indisposed. You will present yourself in my dressing room at 5:15, and you will speak only when spoken to and touch nothing I do not direct you to touch. You will not require explaining twice." She did not wait for an answer. She turned and walked back along the corridor. "Yes, ma'am," said Beatrice, to the empty doorway. She set down the embroidery and began preparing herself. The dressing room of the principal bedroom was well appointed by any standard. Walnut wardrobe cabinets, a 3-paneled mirror in a gilt frame, shelves carrying hat boxes and glove drawers, and Euphemia's considerable wardrobe. The jewelry was in a rosewood case on the dressing table, substantial, because Euphemia bought jewelry with the thoroughness of someone who believes the purchase of something fine to be equivalent to the possession of the quality that produced it. Beatrice laid out what was required: the diamond ear drops, the pearl collar, the sapphire brooch purchased in Leeds the previous spring, the fan and matching reticule. She laid the gown dark green silk with a train, a worth £42 at cost, across the bed. She prepared the gloves, checked the button loops, set the evening slippers beside the dressing table. She did all of this in the unhurried sequence of a woman who has done it before, not in someone else's dressing room as an exercise in service, but as a matter of daily life, as the routine preparation of a person for whom this kind of preparation was the unremarkable default. The familiarity of her hands with the task was, in the mirror's reflection, entirely legible. It was in the course of returning a rejected pendant to the jewelry case that the seed pearl brooch slipped from beneath the collar of her blouse. The chain had caught on a button. She caught the brooch before it fell. In her open palm, the small oval of seed pearls with the garnet center, set in 18-karat gold, given by a dying man to the woman he had married 3 hours before his own death and carried by his daughter against her skin for 2 years and 11 months and 6 days. She should, perhaps, have placed it in her apron pocket before Euphemia looked up. She did not, because Beatrice Wyndham was not a person who hid. What is that? Beatrice looked at the brooch in her palm, and then at Euphemia's reflection in the gilt-framed glass. My own property, ma'am. Let me see it. The pause was 2 seconds. Not the pause of guilt, the pause of a woman deciding that this room was not the correct room for the answer she had, and that the brougham was approximately 2 hours outside of Leeds, and that 2 seconds of patience was neither remarkable nor difficult for a person who had already demonstrated 2 years and 11 months of it. She opened her fingers. Euphemia took the brooch from her palm and held it to the dressing-room light. She was not a woman of deep knowledge about fine jewelry, but she had read, in November of 1866, the estate inventory that Cresswell's office had prepared, a document listing the contents of the principal rooms and the household valuables, and she believed, with the conviction of someone who needs a thing to be true, that she had seen a description of a seed pearl brooch somewhere in that document. I have seen this piece, she said slowly, turning the brooch in the light, in the inventory of Thornfield Park. This is the property of this estate. This was false. The inventory had listed the contents of the Baron's jewelry box and the household silver items that had passed through the formal estate documentation. The seed pearl brooch, given privately in a hospital room in October of 1866 and never recorded in any document anywhere, was not among them. But Euphemia did not know this. What she knew was that the seamstress had not immediately surrendered the brooch when asked, and in Euphemia Sloane's understanding of the world, there was only one reason a servant hesitated when a lady required something. You have helped yourself, she said, to what does not belong to you. I will address this in the appropriate setting. She placed the brooch in her reticule. She dismissed Beatrice from the dressing room with a look. The remainder of the preparation she would manage independently. At 7:10 in the evening, 7 minutes after the last guest had been seated, 3 minutes into the first course, Euphemia Sloane appeared in the dining hall doorway. The conversation died. 14 dinner guests looked up from their soup bowls to find their hostess standing in her dark green silk, correctly dressed, with an expression that communicated the specific intention of a woman who has decided a thing is necessary and will therefore do it entirely correctly. Behind her, a step back, and to her left, in a grey wool dress and a seamstress's apron, stood Beatrice Fenn. I apologize, said Euphemia, taking her seat at the head of the long table, for interrupting the first course. I find I cannot defer a matter of some consequence. She removed the seed pearl brooch from her reticule and placed it on the white tablecloth beside her soup bowl. This woman, she said, not looking at Beatrice directly, the avoidance of direct address was intentional, the particular maneuver of someone who wishes to deny her subject the dignity of being spoken to rather than about, has been living in this household under my roof, on my wages, in my house, for 2 years. She has eaten at my expense, slept under my roof, been given work that suited her capabilities, which were modest, and she has repaid this generosity in the manner one might, with hindsight, have anticipated. She touched the brooch with one gloved finger. This piece of jewelry listed in the inventory of Thornfield Park was found in her possession this evening. In her possession, against her person, beneath her clothing. She allowed a moment for the particularity of this image to settle in the room. People of your sort, she said, and now she did look at Beatrice, looked directly, with the level, unblinking focus of a woman who has been practicing this look in various forms for 20 years, have a very old and very tiresome habit of imagining yourselves entitled to what you could never legitimately hold. You move through a house of consequence, and you look at its contents, and you tell yourselves that proximity confers some measure of right. It does not. Did you mistake the property of your betters for your own? Or did you understand perfectly well what you were doing and proceed regardless? I suspect the latter. A woman who handles good silk in another woman's house does not become the lady who owns it. She becomes a seamstress who has handled silk that is not hers, which is precisely and entirely what you are and what you have always been. She set the 5-shilling coin beside the brooch on the white cloth. Did you pause, before you took it, to consider whether a seamstress in an apron has any business handling the property of a lady at all? Of course you did not. That is the remarkable thing about your kind, the complete absence of the hesitation that breeding produces in people who have been raised correctly. You looked at something that belonged to a lady of standing, and you took it, and you wore it against your skin, as though the wearing of it might make you something other than what you are. It does not. A good piece of jewelry does not elevate the throat that bears it. It simply reveals the distance between the throat and the piece, which in your case is considerable. She let this settle for a moment among the 14 dinner guests, who were attending to their tablecloths, with the focus of people who have decided that the surface of the cloth contains something of consuming interest. This is a dining room for ladies and gentlemen of breeding, not a court of appeal for those who imagine themselves deserving of what they cannot legitimately possess. You are standing on this floor in your apron, because this floor is the appropriate place for a woman in your position, and the apron is the appropriate dress for a woman of your station, and you have been permitted to stand on it for 2 years longer than your conduct merits, in exchange for labor that was never more than barely adequate. We do not extend charity indefinitely to those who abuse it. You will leave Thornfield Park by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. You will take with you precisely what you arrived with, which is to say, nothing of any account, and you will leave behind everything in this house that belongs to this house. The 5 shillings on this table represent your final week's wages. They are more than your conduct merits. Go and be grateful for them, and take care that no future household hears of this evening before you attempt to seek another position. A pause, deliberate in its length. If you are capable, which I rather doubt, of conducting yourself in a future household with more propriety than you have shown in this one. She looked away from Beatrice, back to the table, the expression of a woman who has set something down and considers it resolved. That will be all. At the far end of the table, Eleanor Harcourt, 23 years old, the wife of a recently returned captain, raised by a mother whose opinion on what a person reveals in moments like this was both specific and frequently expressed, shifted in her seat. She drew a breath. She started to say something. Her husband's hand found hers beneath the white tablecloth. The breath stopped. Not entirely, but almost. Lord Alderton, at the table's other end, looked at his soup and then at the portrait of the 3rd Baron Wyndham in its gilt frame on the wall behind the woman in the apron, and looked back at his soup and said nothing at all. And this was the calculation of a man of 71 years who is waiting to understand something fully before he acts on it. No tears, no raised voice, no trembling of the hands, no flinch, no alteration of expression, only the stillness of a woman who has stood in this room every day for 2 years and 11 months knowing what she knows, and who requires now only to wait for a sound that was already, at this moment, approaching through the frost-covered November night outside the south-facing windows of Thornfield Park. At 23 minutes past 7, it came. The crunch of iron-shod wheels on the frost-covered gravel of the carriageway, the measured, unhurried percussion of 2 horses at a collected trot, reached the dining hall through the tall south-facing glass, low and rhythmic against the silence of a room that had stopped breathing without being aware it had stopped. A lantern appeared in the elm trees at the outer edge of the drive, moving in an arc, resolving as the vehicle came fully into view as the near-side lamp of a private brougham. 2 horses, a coachman, a driver who had left Leeds before 3 o'clock in the afternoon and had made slower progress than intended on account of a frost that had begun on the open, more rode and thickened as the afternoon darkened. The brougham stopped at the front steps of Thornfield Park. 2 doors opened, 2 men descended onto the steps. No one in the dining hall spoke. 14 people looked at the south-facing windows, and then at Euphemia at the head of the table, and then at the woman in the grey apron, who had not moved and was watching the door. Mr. Graves appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man who has encountered something outside the categories his training has prepared him for. "I beg your pardon, Mrs. Sloane." He was not interrupted. He was simply superseded by a man stepping past him through the doorway, as though the doorway had always belonged to whoever needed it most. Mr. Arthur Hargreaves was 63 years old, lean and upright, in the way that men who have spent 40 years outdoors in Yorkshire tend to be upright, not as a performance but as a physical residue of a life spent working. He had grey side whiskers, a plain dark coat over a white shirt, and his hat in his right hand. He had not set foot inside Thornfield Park since the evening of the 17th of November, 1866, when he had accepted his 3 weeks' notice and walked out through the back entrance after 19 years as steward of the estate. He came in now through the front. He stepped into the dining hall. He looked, briefly and without particular expression, around the room, at the long table with its 14 guests, and its candelabras, and its 5-course dinner in progress, and its 5-shilling coin on the white cloth. And then his eyes found Beatrice Fenn standing near the door, in her grey dress and her seamstress's apron, and he moved toward her. Not toward the table, around the perimeter of the room, the long way, until he stood directly before her. He stopped. He removed his hat. He bowed not the brief nod of one employee to another, but the full, unhurried, formal bow of a man acknowledging a person whose rank considerably exceeds his own. "Miss Wyndham," he said. His voice was Yorkshire and level, and carried in the silence of the room, without the slightest effort, "forgive the hour." The road from Leeds was difficult in the frost, and we made slower progress than we had intended. The word that formed in Euphemia Sloane's throat and could not complete itself was impossible. It could not complete itself because she was intelligent enough, in this particular moment, to understand that something in Mr. Hargreaves's posture, the specific quality of that bow, the specific quality of those 2 words, Miss Wyndham, did not correspond in any way with a man making an error. Mr. Jonas Whitfield stepped through the doorway behind Hargreaves. He was 48 years old, dark-haired, carrying a brown leather satchel, with the composed, unhurried manner of a Lincoln's Inn solicitor who has delivered consequential documents in difficult rooms for 20 years and has no reason to change his approach for this one. He crossed the dining hall floor to the far end of the long table, the end opposite Euphemia. Sloane placed the satchel on the white cloth and opened it. He withdrew 3 documents and set them, one by one, in a line on the tablecloth. The first was in blue paper, sealed with red wax, bearing the impress of Whitfield and Sons, Lincoln's Inn. The second was in ivory paper, bearing the seal of the Church of Street Anne, Harrogate. The third was in cream paper, bearing the seal of the Lord Lyon, King of Arms, in deep crimson wax. The last will and testament of Bertram Charles Wyndham, 4th Baron Wyndham, said Mr. Whitfield, in the level, unhurried voice of a man who has learned to be heard across rooms of every size and disposition without raising his voice, executed on the 7th of October, 1866, in the presence of 2 witnesses, whose attestations are recorded herein and held in trust by the firm of Whitfield and Sons, Lincoln's Inn, pending the conclusion of probate proceedings, now resolved by order of the Leeds Chancery Court on the 19th of October of this year. He touched the first document, the marriage certificate of Bertram Charles Wyndham, 4th Baron Wyndham, and Catherine Elizabeth Wyndham née Fenn, solemnized on the 14th of October, 1866, at the Church of Street Anne, Harrogate, in the presence of the Reverend Edmund Calder and 2 named witnesses, entered in the parish register of that church on the day of solemnization. He touched the second, a letter dated the 3rd of November of this year, from the Lord Lyon, King of Arms, confirming the legal validity of the said marriage and the consequent status of Miss Beatrice Constance Wyndham as the sole legitimate heir to the Wyndham barony, the estate of Thornfield Park in the county of Yorkshire, and all properties, investments, capital, and entitlements associated therewith, as set out in the will of the 7th of October, 1866. He touched the third. He looked up. Miss Wyndham is the Honourable Miss Beatrice Constance Wyndham, only child of the late Bertram Charles Wyndham, 4th Baron Wyndham, and the late Catherine Elizabeth Wyndham née Fenn, his lawfully wedded wife. She is the rightful and lawful mistress of this house, this estate, and every item of property within and upon it. He glanced, briefly, at the tablecloth, including the brooch. The dining hall of Thornfield Park performed, in the following 10 seconds, the most complete silence it had contained since it was built. 14 people in their evening clothes sat around the long table and understood, in the simultaneous and separate ways of 14 people arriving at the same understanding from 14 different angles, that they had been watching something they had not correctly understood, and that the choice they had made to sit still and say nothing and allow the proceedings to continue had just become considerably more visible than they had realized. Euphemia Sloane sat at the head of the table and did not move. Both hands were flat on the white cloth. The color had gone from her face in the specific way that color leaves a face when the blood that produces it is directed by the body toward more urgent business than maintaining the appearance of composure. Her mouth was slightly open, not in the beginning of speech, in the suspension that precedes the understanding that what is happening cannot be stopped. Beatrice moved. She reached up to her plain linen cap and lifted it from her head. She removed the seamstress's collar at her throat. The white cotton strip, that was the last material marker of the position she had occupied in this house for 2 years and 11 months, and placed both items carefully on the nearest chair. She did not straighten her back, because her back had been straight throughout. She did not lift her chin, because she had not lowered it. She picked up the seed pearl brooch from the white tablecloth beside Euphemia Sloane's untouched soup bowl and fastened it, with both hands, to the collar of her gray dress, above the heart, in the place where her mother had worn it on the one afternoon she had been allowed to, and where her father had placed it with trembling hands in a church in Harrogate in October of 1866. Then she turned to face the room. What followed was not drama. Drama was what the room had organized itself to receive. What followed was something quieter and considerably more durable. Mr. Hargreaves opened his document satchel. He withdrew 9 signed statements, each witnessed by a Leeds notary, collected over the preceding 4 months from former members of the Thornfield Park household. He read 3 aloud. The first was from Mrs. Eleanor Cooper, former housekeeper, dismissed in her 39th year of service, her accounts recorded as short by 3 shillings and 4pence as the stated grounds. Mrs. Cooper stated that on the 2nd of November, 1866, 2 days after the Baron's death, she had observed Mr. Cresswell Gerald Sloane's solicitor alone in the Baron's private study for a period of 2 hours, without any household member present, and without any inventory being made of what was accessed or removed. She had reported this to the new management. She had been dismissed the following week, 3 shillings and 4pence. No one at the table failed to understand what they were hearing. The second was from Mr. Thomas Ford, former butler, 19 years of service, dismissed without adequate character. Mr. Ford stated that on the 4th of November, 1866, he had been present when a clerk from Cresswell's office arrived with 2 empty strong-boxes and removed a quantity of the late Baron's private papers without providing or offering an inventory, and that he had requested an inventory and been told, in direct terms, that this was a legal matter, not within his competence to question. The third was from Agnes Pratt. Agnes Pratt, whom Euphemia Sloane had described to several members of the county when the topic arose, as having left her service to take a more suitable position in the South. Agnes Pratt, who had been given £30 in January of 1867 to leave Thornfield Park and say nothing about what she had seen and what she had been told, and what she had understood about the woman working in the East Wing at 12 shillings per week. Agnes Pratt, who had taken the £30 and found a position in a house in Leeds and had spent 18 months telling herself, on the occasions when she thought about it, that it was not her business, and she had been given no choice, and the money was necessary, and in any case, what could one woman in service do against a solicitor and a household of means? And then a letter had arrived from Lincoln's Inn 14 weeks ago, addressed to her by name, asking very politely whether she would be willing to provide a witnessed statement regarding her time at Thornfield Park. She had needed less than 1 hour to decide how to answer it. Agnes Pratt stated, in a document witnessed by a Leeds notary on the 28th of October last, that she had been present in December of 1866 when Mrs. Sloane received a letter from Cresswell's office and read a portion of it aloud. The portion she recalled with clarity. The matter of Miss Fenn will not cause further difficulty, provided she remains under this roof, where her access to legal remedy may be conveniently limited. No tears, no accusation. No raised voice, only the facts, read in the level Yorkshire voice of a man who had served this estate for 19 years, in a room that was going to have to decide what it had been complicit in. Euphemia's hands were still flat on the tablecloth. Her breathing had changed in a way visible to anyone paying attention, which was, by this point, everyone. Beatrice waited until the third statement had been read. Then she looked, for the first time since Hargreaves had bowed, directly at Euphemia Sloane, not with anger, because anger would have been a concession to the idea that Euphemia's actions were capable of producing something in her other than patience, not with triumph, because triumph implies uncertainty about the outcome, and she had not been uncertain, with the specific, measured attention of a person addressing a matter that requires addressing, and no more than that. "Mr. Graves," she said, without raising her voice. The butler straightened. He had been reading this room carefully for the past half hour and had arrived at conclusions. "Miss Wyndham," he said, "Mr. and Mrs. Sloane will require their coachman in the morning. They may use the guest rooms on the north corridor for this evening. The remainder of the house, the principal rooms, the library, the dining room, the drawing room, the estate offices, is no longer at their disposal as of this hour." She paused. "The East Wing room I have been occupying is not to be made available to them. I shall be resuming its use." She looked at the 5-shilling piece on the white tablecloth. "Please return that to Mrs. Sloane. I have no use for it." Lord Alderton, 71 years old, owner of Alderton Hall for 40 years, a man who had visited Thornfield Park under 2 previous barons and who had been quietly, patiently assembling his understanding of the Sloanes for 2 years, from the position of a man who does not act on incomplete information, picked up his wine-glass. He was not, in the ordinary way, given to gestures. He raised it, briefly and without comment, toward the woman in the grey dress. His wife raised hers alongside. Eleanor Harcourt, at the far end of the table, did not pick up her glass. She looked at her husband with an expression that communicated, with clarity, that she had been right, that she had known she was right, and that she considered the evening's events to constitute a sufficient demonstration of this without requiring further elaboration from her. The dinner was not resumed. Gerald Sloane received the news in the smoking room at 8:30. His response was described by the footman outside the door as sustained and increasingly incoherent, with the phrase, "but Cresswell said," recurring, in diminishing confidence, across 3 separate attempts to construct a position from which the evening's events could be recovered. He had done what he was told, signed what was put before him, and had been informed this evening that the person who had told him what to do and what to sign had been operating in an area that had specific and substantial legal consequences, and that those consequences had now arrived. Gerald's primary contribution to this situation was to have signed the documents. He had done so. There was very little else to be said. The Sloanes left Thornfield Park at 9:30 on the morning of the 15th, their possessions loaded into 2 vehicles rather than the one they had arrived in. Euphemia descended the front steps in her travelling coat with the expression of a woman who is determined that dignity requires appearing to treat the departure as an outcome she has considered and accepted rather than one that has been imposed upon her. She did not look back at the house as the carriages moved down the elm-lined drive. A kitchen maid watching from an upstairs window saw her press a handkerchief once to her mouth before the carriageway curved and Thornfield Park was no longer visible. Then the curve, and then nothing. What followed was the unglamorous, patient, unspectacular work of putting something right. Cresswell's involvement was referred to the appropriate authorities in Leeds within the fortnight. The matter took several months, involved the careful re-examination of documentation Cresswell had apparently believed adequately buried, and proved less buried than he had imagined. He was disbarred in the spring of 1869. The subsequent proceedings occupied a Leeds courtroom through much of the following year, resulting in a fine representing approximately 1/3 of what he had been paid and a formal order of restitution to the Wyndham estate for a further sum. His firm did not survive the proceedings. Gerald Sloane's business accounts partially secured, it emerged, against the anticipated income from Thornfield Park, were called in within 6 weeks of the departure from the estate. He and Euphemia relocated to a property in Sheffield considerably smaller than Thornfield Park, in a neighbourhood that did not appear in the social directories that mattered to Euphemia. She wrote letters to the county acquaintances in January of 1869, careful, composed letters on good paper, referencing shared acquaintances and forthcoming occasions. Some received brief, polite replies. Most received no reply at all. The Alderton household sent a note acknowledging receipt, containing no invitation. By the spring of 1869, the process was complete in the way that these things complete themselves in Yorkshire. No open condemnation, no formal exclusion, simply an absence of the inclusions that make social life possible. The name Sloane was spoken, when it was spoken at all, with the particular careful neutrality that in that county means considerably worse than open disapproval. It means the matter is finished, and no one intends to discuss it further. The evening of the 14th of November concluded in the way that evenings of that nature conclude when there is nothing further to perform. The 14 dinner guests departed in their carriages at various intervals between 9 and 10 o'clock, some of them stopping briefly to speak with Beatrice in the entrance hall before they left. Brief words, measured, the kind of words that people choose when they are trying to acknowledge something without claiming they had understood it earlier than they had. Lord Alderton shook her hand, which was not something men of Lord Alderton's age and position commonly did with women they had, until 45 minutes ago, believed to be seamstresses, and said nothing beyond Thornfield Park is well looked after. His wife said, "My dear," and pressed her hand, which communicated rather more. Eleanor Harcourt, departing last, said simply, "I should have said something sooner." Beatrice said there was no need. Eleanor Harcourt said, with the directness of a woman who had been raised by a mother with a particular opinion on the subject. There was rather a great deal of need. She was not wrong, and Beatrice did not pretend otherwise. Gerald Sloane was located in the smoking room at 8:30, where the news reached him via Euphemia and was received, according to the footman outside the door, with sustained unpleasantness and the increasingly unconvincing repetition of Cresswell's name in a diminishing confidence. Old servants were found and invited back. Mr. Ford, 61 years old and not well after 2 years of uncertain circumstances, returned for the spring and stayed through the summer. Beatrice arranged, without announcement, that the household accounts provide for his retirement with comfort adequate for a man who had given 19 years. Mrs. Cooper returned to find the household accounts in a condition that reflected 2 years of management by someone who had not understood what they were managing, and set about restoring them with the quiet, focused efficiency of a woman returning to work she had never considered finished. The library was recatalogued. The portrait of the 3rd Baron Wyndham was returned to its position in the principal corridor. The kitchen garden, neglected through 2 winters, was replanted in the spring with the assistance of a head gardener from Harrogate, who had worked the same ground under the previous household, and who found, on his return, that the soil had not forgotten what it was for. In March of 1869, Beatrice opened a small school in the estate's west outbuilding for the children of Thornfield Park's tenant farmers and labourers. This attracted some comment from neighbouring landowners, who observed that educating tenants' children produced tenants who asked uncomfortable questions. Beatrice received these observations with the same composed attention she had extended to every other variety of opinion she had encountered across the preceding 3 years, and continued. In the same month, she established the Wyndham Household Fund, a small monthly contribution, matched from the estate accounts, held in trust for the benefit of domestic servants in circumstances of dismissal without adequate character. It was a specific provision for a specific vulnerability, which she understood from 2 years and 11 months of direct personal experience to be one that could arrive for any woman who found herself in the wrong house, the wrong moment, without the right kind of protection. She established it without making a speech about it. 6 months after the Sloanes' departure, on a March morning when the kitchen garden was showing the first careful green of new planting and the frost had finally finished with the moor road for the season, Beatrice stood at the north-facing window of the east wing room. She had not moved to the principal bedroom. She had come back to this room, the smallest in the wing, the cold one, the one with the window that looked onto the kitchen garden and admitted very little afternoon light, because it was a good room, and it faced the thing that was growing, and because it was, more than any other room in the house, hers in the way that only a room you have actually lived in can be yours, with the knowledge of its particular draughts, and the angle at which the morning light came through the glass, and the way the floorboard on the left side of the door announced itself when the temperature changed. She stood at the window with a cup of tea that was still hot, because the kitchen now remembered what it was for. She had not wept when they took the brooch from her throat in the dressing room. She had not wept when Euphemia held it up before 30 people and called her a thief. She had not wept when Whitfield read the will aloud, and the dining hall fell into that absolute, irrevocable silence. She wept now once, briefly, standing at the north-facing window in the east wing room that was hers, looking at the rows of new planting in the kitchen garden below, the evidence of something coming back. Then she set down the teacup. She went to her desk. There were accounts to review, a letter from Whitfield regarding the Cresswell proceedings, a note from the Harrogate schoolmaster about the new school, a meeting with the head gardener at 10:30. She sat down and opened the accounts. There is a quality that privilege cannot purchase and poverty cannot remove. It accumulates invisibly through the decisions a person makes when no one who matters is watching, and there is nothing to be gained from making them correctly, in the way a person treats a kitchen maid on a Tuesday morning in February when the cold has made everyone sharp and the morning has started badly, in the capacity to wait with directed patience for the correct moment rather than demanding the wrong one, in the ability to stand on a cold marble floor in a room full of 30 people who have chosen silence and to remain, under every pressure to do otherwise, entirely oneself. Euphemia Sloane had spent 20 years and a Sheffield inheritance trying to purchase this quality. She had bought the correct silver, and the correct gown, and the correct house, and the correct servants, and the correct dinner guests, and had arranged them all with the diligence of a woman who believes that a correct arrangement, properly maintained, will eventually produce the thing she is arranging it to look like. She had never been capable of understanding that it is not for sale, not at any price, not through any arrangement, not by any combination of Worth gowns and Yorkshire dinner guests and estate inventories and solicitors, paid £312 in 3 installments. Because what she was attempting to purchase is not an acquisition. It is a residue. It is what remains in a person after every comfortable option and every face-saving escape has been removed, and the only thing left is what they actually are. She had not understood this. She had never been required to. Beatrice had been required to understand it every day for 2 years and 11 months, in a cold room with a north-facing window, at 12 shillings per week, in the house that was hers. She had understood it through the October of the curtain rings and the missing 3 shillings and 4 pence. She had understood it in the January of the embroidery frame moved to the servants' corridor. She had understood it in every passing remark, delivered without eye contact, and every meal sent up thin and every coal allowance calculated at the minimum it was possible to call provision. She had understood it not as a lesson in humility. She had not required humility, because there is nothing humble about a person who knows what they are worth and simply waits for the appropriate time to say so, but as a daily exercise in remaining herself, entirely, without concession, across nearly 3 years of sustained pressure to become something smaller. The result of this exercise was visible to Lord Alderton at 71 years old in the way he raised his glass. It was either there or it was not. It was there in Beatrice Wyndham on the morning she arrived at Thornfield Park as a seamstress, with mended gloves and a seed-pearl brooch against her skin and 2 years and 11 months of patience ahead of her. It was there in the north-facing room, with the inadequate coal allowance and the thin meals and the long Yorkshire winters. It was there when she stood on the marble floor in the dining hall and said nothing at all, while 30 people watched and made their choices. It was there when she fastened the brooch above her heart and turned to face the room not in triumph, not in anger, but in the specific settled composure of a person who has never, at any moment in the preceding 3 years, been someone other than exactly who she was. It was there on the March morning when she wept once at a north-facing window and then went to her desk, because there was work to do, and it was hers, and she had always known that. Pride may dress itself in Worth gowns and good silver, but character wears considerably longer. The house at Thornfield Park has stood for 214 years. In March of 1869, on a cold morning when the frost was finally finished, it knew its mistress again. If this story has stayed with you, we would love to read your thoughts in the comments. What do you believe is the true measure of a person's worth, and when have you seen it matter most? Your reflections are what keep these stories alive. Thank you for watching. Disclaimer: this story is entirely fictional and created with the assistance of AI for entertainment purposes only. It is set against a Victorian-era backdrop for dramatic effect and does not claim historical accuracy in every detail. It does not refer to, represent, or target any real individual, family, title, or estate, living or deceased. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental.